at least not more than 10 minutes late. So Daniel, can you introduce the next panel?
I can. So our next panel, the session is titled "The Recent Rise of Classical Charter Schools," and our first panelist is Heather Brown. She's on the end there. She's launched 4 charter schools during her career and is currently headmaster of Founders Classical Charter Academy. Our second panelist, or the person who will present second, is Maegen Satcher, and she's a classical pedagogy trainer at Hillsdale College, which has had a number of a really large initiative to expand classical charter schools across the United States. And then finally, we have Albert Cheng. He's an assistant professor at the well-known Department of Ed Reform at the University of Arkansas. And he's also director of his new lab, the Classical Education Research Lab at the University of Arkansas. So thank you. And Heather, could you get us started?
Great, thank you so much. First, I just want to say this has been a delightful day and a half for me. The conversations have been wonderful and diverse and interactive, and I just love hearing from every person that's been on this stage today in the conversations over a cup of coffee. Great conversations. So I started my journey as an educator, first as a mom, and I was in early childhood education, partly just because my kids were little. And I had a desire and a passion to be intricately involved in what my kids were doing. And so began in early childhood education and did that for about 20 years and really loved that space. But I also was naive as a parent. And I think some of us who are young and have children young are naive. And I was very naive to assume that the traditional public school down the street was going to do a good job for my students and for my children. And in some ways, they did a great job. And my children made good friends and had some excellent teachers. But I noticed things started to change as my children got into high school. And my daughter came home one day and shared a story about a young man sitting next to her in a science class who was conducting some personal inappropriate behavior under the desk on himself. And we got a call from the school principal. And I realized that something needed to change for us. And something needed to change for me as an early childhood educator. And the reality was that the schools in our very well test scoring neighborhood had some problems, and whether it was a teacher problem or whether it was a student management problem or a supervision problem, whatever it wasn't working. And I was also beginning to see it undermine the values that we had at home and the things we were instilling in our children, not out of a desire to protect them from the world, because the reality is they live every day, day in and day out, with things that are gonna be challenging to their belief systems from our home, but they needed to know how to deal with them in a positive manner and with some resolute belief and virtue in their lives. And so I began to seek out a way to be involved in education and make a change where I was making an impact on students' lives so that they were young men and women of virtue, and they did have the ability to think and reason and were well educated so that they could make good decisions. And that led me to classical education. And so I began to teach at a local charter school. I lived in Northern California at the time, and I was a founding teacher at a classical school in Northern California and worked through the process of eventually leading the 3 schools and being in a superintendent position and then training teachers and continuing to open charter schools. If you know anything about the state of California and charter schools in California, it's not an easy task. And the bureaucracy and the requirements from authorizers and the hoops that we had to jump through were extensive. And so my husband and I were looking for a change as our children graduated from their high schools. And I went to a conference that was hosted by Responsive Education Solutions in Texas, along with the Koch Foundation. And it was really a symposium of classical school leaders from across the nations who weren't parochial schools, but were public charters. There's a lot of support for faith-based classical schools. There's great organizations, and they've come together and really built a united organization. But 6, 7 years ago, there wasn't a lot of support for classical charters with the exception of Hillsdale College. And so we were looking to find a way to band together. And at that conference, I met a few gentlemen who ran Responsive Education Solutions. And what they were doing resonated with me because they not only wanted to educate students well, but they wanted to provide them hope for their future. Not just about getting a degree, not just about getting a job, which we talked a little bit about yesterday, and Emily shared about that, or not just about going to college, but about becoming men and women who had an idea of what civic responsibility was. Young men and women who could step into a voting booth someday and make a decision based on their educated reason, based on their understanding of the topics and the issues that are facing our nation, and based on their moral compass and the virtue that they hold within themselves. And so whether these conversations as our graduates are happening around the dinner table with their children, or they're happening in a voting booth or around a water cooler at work, they're important conversations. And so I was drawn to what Responsive Ed was doing. And so I decided to take the leap and join Responsive Ed because their story is a strong one. They started over 20 years ago with 15 dropout recovery programs. Their goal was not classical education initially, but Responsive Ed's goal was to serve students who were dropping out of high school. And so over the last 25 years, they have grown to have over 100 schools in 2 different states. A portion of those schools are classical schools, and that's the arm of Responsive Education Solutions that I work for. And so in 11 years ago, we started with a single classical school in a suburb of Dallas. And now the classical branch of Responsive Education Solutions, which is Founders Classical Academies, now has 23 schools serving over 12,000 students across 2 states. It's exciting to see what we're doing. One of the things I wanted to share with you today, and that was brought up in the earlier conversation, is about diversity in school. Something exciting is happening in Texas in the charter school space and in the classical space, and it's really fun to be part of it. I hope you can see that I love what I do, and I absolutely love serving these children. But we were surprised to find the great diversity coming to our campuses. I work in an assistant superintendent role, and I also am the head of a campus. And at my campus, we opened 2 years ago. This is our 3rd year. We did not anticipate the great diversity in our school. My campus is only 41% Caucasian. And we have this beautiful, rich culture that is a part of our campus, a part of all of our campuses across Texas. We have a school in Mesquite, which is a suburb of Dallas, that is 91% Hispanic or at risk. And these students are coming to a classical charter school, and they're getting a beautiful education. My favorite story is about our El Paso campus, which is right near the border. We have 87 students every morning at our El Paso campus that get up at 5 a.m. and they hop on a bus and they cross the border from Mexico to come to school. We serve them breakfast, and before school even starts at the traditional 8 o'clock time, those students go to English classes and learn English. Then they participate in classical education throughout the day. They have to get back on the bus in the evening to go home. Most of these students are high school students, which I think is telling because they're motivated and they're happy and they're seeking something unique and special. So much so that a lot of these students return on Saturdays for a full day of English lessons and continued tutoring in their classical education. And I think that's such a beautiful story for what we're doing. And so I'm excited about what Responsive Ed and Founders Classical is able to do and sort of step out of that traditional and typical classical education mindset. Because often within classical education, you think that it's an education for the white elite. It's an education for the students who might have money or the students who might have privilege. But the beauty is we're serving kids across multiple cultures, across multiple socioeconomic groups, and we're providing them this beautiful, virtue-based, culturally literate educational process where they are thriving and they are learning and they are blossoming. And it's so exciting to see that. And it's exciting to see then what they're going to do when they step out our doors and they become important and key members of their local neighborhood, of their state, and they're civically minded and they're civically educated. So then they make great decisions and impact the world around them and their neighborhoods and their families. And that's what our goal is.
Maegen?
Well, thank you, Heather. My name is Maegen Satcher. I primarily identify as a first grade teacher. I was a first grade teacher in a traditional public school in Clay County, Florida for approximately 10 years. And when Hillsdale College started the Barney Charter School Initiative, I was able to join a founding effort through some local citizens in Clay County and join as a first grade teacher at St. John's Classical Academy. And I always like to tell people St. John's Classical is a public charter school located on the St. John's River, just north of St. John's County. So it is not a Catholic school. And I found through recruitment efforts that whenever I would say St. John's, they always immediately thought I was coming from a classical school. So I was a teacher and then a school leader for a number of years. And last year, I was able to join Hillsdale College, and I work for the K-12 teacher support team. So today I just want to focus on what our work is and tell you just a little bit, because I'm coming actually from Wyoming. And I was just at one of our schools that opened a month ago and on the ground work with them just earlier this week, which I apologize was the reason I was not here yesterday. It's very interesting to wake up on the west coast of America in rural Wyoming and land in Boston at 6 p.m. I think it shows who we are as a country. So Hillsdale College's mission is to promote the founding of classical schools and their excellence in teaching and operation so that American students may be educated in the liberal arts and sciences and receive instruction in the principles of moral character and civic virtue. The students that are enrolled in our schools receive a thorough and well-rounded American classical education in the liberal arts and sciences. The college itself was founded in 1844, and about 33 years ago, 2023, about 33 years ago, sort of got into the business of K-12. This college opened Hillsdale Academy, which is a private school at Hillsdale College. And then about 10 years ago, opened the Barney Charter School Initiative, which is many schools throughout the United States have opened with the assistance of the Barney Charter School Initiative. The majority of those schools are public charter schools. And what we aim to do is provide them with the resources that they need to be successful. Our schools open in sort of two categories. We have member schools and we have curriculum schools. Curriculum schools are able to use by license our curriculum. It's available to them for free. And they also receive a list of all of the instructional materials that are used to coincide with what's within what we call our program guide. So they get the curriculum, which spans K-12, and they also receive this list of materials to teach. The member schools have additional support. They get the support of the Hillsdale K-12 office. And the Hillsdale K-12 office is sort of what we've used to replace the terminology Barney Charter School Initiative because now it's an umbrella term. And our office, specifically the work that I do, we connect with teachers and leaders on the ground. And there are 7 of us, I believe, 7 on the teacher support team. And we coach them on pedagogy, curriculum. We work with school leaders. Other members of our office work with school leaders on leadership. We have an arm of our office that works with founding groups, and we coach on governance. And we also work on coaching on the culture of a school. So the member schools get a bit more support than the curriculum schools. Right now, we have about 23 member schools and dozens of curriculum schools throughout the country. There is a high demand for our schools. Every year, we open new schools. This past school year, we had 4 schools come on board in terms of membership or candidate membership. And next year, I think we're looking at close to 10. So the demand is there. It's coming from all different parts of the country. Our relationship with the schools is a bit unique. We do not have any governing power over our schools. We are simply there as an arm of support. We don't take any money, none, not a penny of money, either directly or indirectly from any of the schools. Our work is supported through Friends of Hillsdale College and their they're wanting to work arm in arm with us in this initiative. So we do own, manage, or profit from any of our schools. And I think that's important because our relationship is just that. It's a relationship, a very human thing that we're working with very human people on the ground to do something very well and to do it with passion. So the majority, we are a small office. The teacher support team is probably the bulk of the office, to be honest, but we are small. The bulk of our support is by people who have been either teachers or school leaders. So they've been on the ground and they've done this. Personally, I know what work it goes into planting a school. If you've never had the enjoyment of doing that, you walk out with some battle stripes and a lot of knowledge. So there's a bit of courage that it takes to plant a school and to stick with it. It takes a lot of perseverance to be part of anything that's new. I kind of chuckled when I saw the title, The Recent Rise of Classical Education at Harvard. And I kind of laughed because Harvard is an institution of the liberal arts, historically, yes, and the rise of classical education. The principal that I most recently worked for said, we didn't used to use the term classical education when my grandparents were in school. We just went to school. And so I think that the term is kind of funny because it's a recent rise of, it's a reemergence of something that has historically been the way that humans have been educated. And it's tried and it's true. And it's absolutely a delight to be a part of. My area of sort of passion and what gets me stirred up and why I ultimately went to go work for Hillsdale College is I'm very invested in literacy. And that's been my main focus for the last 20 years of my life. And we happen to have a literacy program that is everything that any child would ever need. It's explicit phonics instruction, but it goes so much further than that. Students are taught how to write well. They learn about grammar and syntax, so they're not just focused on words. I mean, words don't just out there in isolation. They are parts of sentences. Sentences are parts of paragraphs, and paragraphs are parts of books, right? So what we are able to do is we are able to take explicit phonics instruction and then pair that with content-rich curriculum. I feel like I want to just clap time for people like Natalie Wexler and Emily Hanford. I don't know if you're familiar with them. Natalie Wexler wrote The Knowledge Gap, and Emily Hanford has a podcast out now that if you have not listened to, I suggest you do. It's called Soul to Story. And these two journalists, they have a capacity for reading research and understanding what it means, and then being able to convey that information to the general public. And so what's exciting about that is that the classical schools have what they are saying we need to teach kids how to read. We can't just teach phonics without a content-rich curriculum. Most of the state assessments, Wexler would argue, are knowledge-based tests. So we're putting kids down in front of concepts that they've never studied before. Well, if they've gone through a classical school, they're learning history from kindergarten on, both ancient and American. They're learning science, and it's cyclical, and it's really awesome to watch a kindergartner learn about the human body. And then you go into a fourth grade class, and they're writing on the circulatory system. And the vocabulary that they've acquired over those 5 years, it's so immense. And if you've never seen it in action, I suggest you get in and visit a classical school. The way that we approach all of the content areas, it's through questioning. And so our students are highly engaged. There is no ability to sort of hide in the classroom. We use a lot of cold calling when appropriate and choral response. And we want to make sure that all of our kids are learning. So we think about questioning, we think about students from the most struggling student to the highest student, and how can we reach them? And so kind of going back to this idea of literacy, another, I don't want to I'm sorry. I get going and then I'm going to take too much time. Sorry. Keep me, got to keep me on time. Literacy and numeracy. In our schedules and how we do our schedules during the day is we have this, what we call prescribed punctuated practice. So reading isn't just taught first thing in the morning and then ignored the rest of the day. And math isn't just taught first thing in the morning and then ignored the rest of the day. When I coach teachers, I tell them it's a bit like a high intensity interval training. They're in and out of these concepts in order to build long-term memory. And so with literacy, what we're doing is we're building their mental toolbox to break the code of English. They're learning not just the sounds, but they're learning the orthographic principles, the morphological and etymological roots of language. And we teach all of the content. Every single subject is taught. I've spoken about math and literacy. We teach history. We teach civics. Our students learn poetry. They start formal Latin once they get to 6th grade. In mathematics, we have them master their math facts, which the public school that I was at in the early 2000s, we just quit doing that. And if you think about it, they need the automaticity of knowing 7 and 9, for example, if they're trying to solve complex story problems. I have had the great pleasure, and I think Heather can probably speak to this as well. When you see students who come in who are struggling, or maybe they've had behavioral issues in their local school, and they come in to a classical school, and you see what happens to their minds, and you realize a lot of these students were bored. There's been such an emphasis on just literacy and just numeracy, and they haven't had sort of the meat and potatoes of what makes learning enjoyable. So when we hire teachers, and we meaning the schools, because Hillsdale does not do that, it's each headmaster's role to hire teachers, we're looking for people who have a zeal for learning. They love their content. They want to continue to learn. They wonder about their subject, and they're able to stand in front of their class and make it so that it's infectious for students. If you think about your own teachers, the ones that you enjoyed the most are the ones who had a passion for their subject and they were able to reach you as a student. And so that is what the teacher support team does to work with our teachers. We also have resources available outside of the humans that do the work. We have a digital portal where teachers can go and access lesson plans and videos, white papers, and we work with everybody that's in our network. So if we have a really good, let's say 5th grade science teacher, we'll connect another 5th grade teacher with that science teacher. Many of our schools, especially the high schools, there will only be one biology teacher, one chemistry teacher, one economics teacher. So it's neat because you get to pair maybe a teacher who's in Georgia with a teacher who is teaching at, right off of an Indian reservation, Native American reservation in New Mexico. So there's just a lot that's going on that's excellent. And we have a passion for teaching. That's why we're in this. We like to have everybody learning from birth to death. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So does it sound like I'm hot?
Yeah, I guess switch on.
All right. So what I want to talk about is just some of the work that we're doing at the Classical Education Research Lab. And in particular, I want to highlight 2 reports that we've released recently to describe the state of classical education. And so one's a report documenting the growth of the classical charter sector in Texas. The other, I'm going to talk a little bit about the private sector as well, even though I know the title is about classical or about charter schools. So just to tell you a little bit about what we did, and hopefully this will give you a picture of what's going on. So essentially for this report, we took Texas administrative data and looked at enrollment growth for the last decade. Okay, and so broke it out overall and also by race and ethnicity, also by grade level. You can see some numbers there just overall. I mean, right now in Texas, there's over 1,000 charter school campuses serving nearly 350,000 students. 39 of them now are classical charter school campuses serving just under 20,000 students. Okay, and I'll also show you some results where we surveyed parents, about 400 of them, who send their kids to these classical charter schools. So let's dig into this and give you a sense of what's going on here, at least in Texas. So the first graph I have for you is a trend line of the enrollment in classical charter schools as a share of total charter school enrollment. So first of all, on the y-axis, you can see the numbers are kind of small. So it's still as a share of all charter school students, a small group of charter school students that go to classical schools. But you can see over the past 10 years, it's tripled from 2% to 6% of total charter school enrollment share. You can you can look at this a different way. So what this graph here shows is percentage change in enrollment since the 2011 and 2012 school year. And there's two lines on this graph. The orange line is the growth in enrollment for non-classical charter schools. The blue line is for classical charter schools. And you can see a pretty large divergence in the growth. And so we're getting some pretty high percentage changes, 600%, so 7-fold increase among classical charter schools. Part of this is just because they start with a small group of schools of 10 years ago, and so the denominator is kind of small. But what I want to highlight here is that if you zoom back 20 years ago, when Texas started to have charter schools, all the big networks that we see today, IDEA public schools, KIPP, they looked exactly like the classical charter schools are today. So back then, that's what they looked like. And so you had this kind of extreme growth in these major networks that we're all familiar with today. And so it seems like the charter sector is kind of following in that wake these days. So big growth, if you look at it this way in terms of percentage change. Just a little, some tidbits about what does it look like by grade level, by some other student subgroups. So Heather Brown was talking about some of the different student populations that are coming to the Founders Academies, and this is happening across the board. So kind of the second bullet point on this slide gives you some indication of where the growth is happening if you break out by student race and ethnicity. So highest growth is among Asian students in Texas. So we have a 13-fold increase over the past 10 years in terms of enrollment growth in classical charter schools. Second fastest growing student population going to classical charter schools in Texas are Hispanics, where there's a 9-fold increase. So you can see there also on the slide there, growth among white students is by a factor of 6. Black student enrollment increased by a factor of about 1.5. We're seeing growth consistent across all grade levels as well. Most of the growth is on the upper grades. I forget if it was a conversation we were just having before our panel here, or if you mentioned this. A lot of schools open with limited grade levels at the elementary school level. And so what we're kind of seeing is this kind of a history here where you've had all these schools that have opened 10, 15 years ago, opening up at the younger grades, and now they're beginning to have their kids age to the high school levels. And so you're seeing a ton of growth happening at the secondary level, and then still even at the younger grade levels, this consistent growth. So kindergarten, for instance, enrollment up by a factor of 4, or 4-fold increase in enrollment. At the 7th grade, it's enrollment growth about 10-fold over the last 10 years. I just want to show you this graph. There's a lot of information there. This is from a parent survey that we administered to parents who send their kids to classical charter schools in Texas. And this is a graph. So we asked parents, among other things, what they believe the purpose of education is. And so what was striking about our finding, I'll highlight, I think maybe 2 broad strokes of these results here. So we talked a little bit about, kind of how parents are downplaying the importance of future employment and college. So if you look on this list, this is rank ordered by percentage of parents thinking certain goals are extremely important. Employment and college success. So first of all, a vast majority of parents think they're still important. But relative to a lot of other things, they're at the bottom of the list. What's showing up at the top of the list? It's exactly what Heather was talking about earlier. Love of truth, uniting truth with wisdom, virtue formation, character formation, how to be a good citizen, how to be a good person. All those kinds of things are what parents who send their kids to these schools believe education should ultimately be about. And so what we're seeing here is, I think we did the survey to try to explain what's going on. And I think one of the stories is that these schools are offering something distinctive that parents want. We asked them about satisfaction. Actually, we've heard a number of times over the course of this day and a half about wanting parents to see their kids happy as an outcome. And so we asked this, actually. 70% of parents who responded to the survey said that they strongly agree that their child enjoys being at their school. Nationally, if we look at national data, so there is one data point where if you look at charter schools in southern states, what percent of parents say the same thing, that they strongly agree that their child enjoys being at the school? It's only 40%. So I think that's pretty striking. And of course, there's some sample issues there, but striking that 70%, I think that's a pretty high mark in terms of parents expressing that their kids enjoys being at the school. So that's just some data of what's going on in the charter sector in Texas. I want to move on to just give you a taste of what's going on in the private school sector. And so recently was involved with one of the major national organizations in the classical private school space, the Society for Classical Learning. And they launched a school leaders study just to get a sense of what's going on among their member schools. And so some information about what the survey entails. So this is back in the earlier part of the year. We had about 150 heads of schools, 30% response rate, respond to the survey that asked about enrollments, financial information, head of school background, their well-being, indicators of school climate, lots of other things. But I want to show you some data points from that survey. So this first histogram here is a breakdown of how old the schools are, okay? And keep in mind, these are private sector schools. And what I want to highlight is that first bar, which shows that 1/5 of the schools have opened within the last 5 years, okay? And so what we were kind of seeing in Texas, and maybe what we're seeing anecdotally across the country, in the charter sector, anecdotally in the private sector, it's being borne out by the data that the classical sector, both charter and private, is experiencing, I don't know, maybe they like to use the word renaissance instead of whatever the word is in the title is, but that's really happening. It's being borne out in the national data. Just to give you a sense of how big these schools are, so the first pair of bars at the very top, so that's for all the schools in the Thriving Schools study. Average student enrollment size, 230 students. Okay, and then how many full-time equivalent employees are serving these students? About 36 on average. If we break it out by school age, you can see, perhaps not surprisingly, that the older schools, the very bottom there, schools that are at least 16 years old are a little bit larger. But, among the new schools that are opening, 72 students on average in terms of total student enrollment, served by an average of 13 full-time equivalent employees. This is a report that we're about to release, so don't share this just yet. You can take a picture, just don't tweet it. So, some of the conversations that we're having, or that folks in the movement are having about, or how do we address teacher shortages? How do we attract high-quality teachers? And so there's conversations about teacher salaries. And so as you can see, there is this gap in teacher salary if you compare schools in the survey sample from the private classical sector to their neighboring public school districts. And so there's a gap, at least if you look at that middle bar, which is the average salary for teachers with only a bachelor's degree of about $18,000. And so These are some of the things and the conversations that are going on, certainly in the private sector. And I think being around folks in the charter space as well. How do we address the teacher shortage? How do we train teachers well to teach well and to maintain the mission of these schools, to maintain the vision of teaching truth, goodness, beauty, to get kids to love learning? These are all conversations that are going on. So anyway, and last thing, you might be wondering, how much are these schools charging? If you break out by grammar, logic, rhetoric, which roughly maps onto elementary, middle, and high school levels. At least in the private sector, those are the average amounts. So rhetoric, for instance, the high school levels, yearly tuition about $9,000. So I'll stop there. I could talk way more about data. You can look at go to lab website to see a lot more of what we're doing in terms of research in classical education as well. So
Thanks, Albert. So I'd like to follow up with what you said about teachers and teacher labor markets being sort of tight. It seems that when you look at most teacher preparation programs, that they may not offer the level of skills and knowledge that a classical education teacher might need. So with these new schools expanding so fast, it seems like staffing them presents a considerable challenge. So how do you deal with that? Especially given the salaries that you just showed.
Right. Well, I think first, many of the teachers are drawn by the school's mission to come, but it's exactly what you're saying. We have an entire generation of educators who did not, for the most part, receive a classical education. So I would say, and this is what we coach our teachers on, is that the curriculum is very formative for them, especially in the first year. And so they have to really read. It's that simple, but we really do have teachers that don't read anymore. So in order to prep for, let's say, a lesson on ancient Mesopotamia, you're going to have to read and you're going to have to annotate a text. And so what I have found is that because the content is so delightful and they actually enjoy teaching the subjects, it's not that hard to get people to come and teach at a classical school. It's harder to get them to stay because the workload is more than what they're used to in terms of the personal study that is involved.
I would piggyback on that and just share a story. We recently had a teacher at our school. Had come from a traditional public school where they were very accustomed to textbook and reading with their students through the textbook. And then the students would answer the questions at the end of the chapter, and then they'd provide a test. And so they were very used to that style of teaching, and were frustrated when they came into a history class and they said, "Where's my textbook?" And I said, "Here's the Constitution. Read it. Talk about it, ask questions about it." And that, for a lot of teachers, is incredibly intimidating and scary because they themselves may not have interacted with a primary source document, let alone be able to break it down for students and have a discussion and then provide that historical context that they need. And I agree with you, it's difficult to find talent at times that's ready to take on that challenge. And so one of the things that I know you're committed to at Hillsdale and that we're very committed to at Founders is that we have to train and support our teachers. Easier said than done, because there's only so many hours in a day, and there's papers to grade, and there's dishes to do when you get home, and there's parent conferences to have. And so I think that continues to be one of our universal challenges, is carving out the time to train our teachers well, to invest in them, to coach them, to help them invest in the curriculum. And so it points back to what Maegen shared, is you look for that teacher with that passion and that joy and that sense of wonder, because if they have that, they'll pursue it on their own. And then in pursuing it on their own, they translate that passion to the students sitting in their classes.
Well, I'm curious as to what is classical education. I'm just, on the one hand, I think of it, here, can you hear me?
So what is classical education? Is it reading Homer or the Aeneid, or is it the learning about Mesopotamia, or is it the U.S. Constitution? I mean, what is classical? I mean, I can think of a lot of classical things out there. Is it Chinese classical education, for that matter, or Indian? So, I mean, there's a lot of civilizations out there, and a lot of them, in my view, are pretty classic. So what is classical education?
All of the above.
So then is there really anything to this?
It's education in the liberal arts and sciences, and we focus on moral and civic virtue. Yes. So it's very historical. We don't do a whole lot of we don't do a whole lot of current events in a classical school. We want our students to have read the Constitution or read the Declaration before they start writing or speaking on it. So reading primary source documents, especially in the upper school, it's very important. We want them to know things before they speak and write on those things. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah.
Please do.
So, Paul, I think, when you underscore that there are a lot of these civilizations, and I think what unites them is that all of them were asking enduring perennial questions that we even ask today. What does being virtuous mean? Plato, right? What's justice, right? Which is the whole question in the Republic. How do I be a good person? What do I owe my neighbor? These are enduring questions that we wrestle with today. And I think what classical education does is it invites folks to be in that, we call it a great conversation, right? That this is a conversation that has been going across time, across cultures, and they're relevant to today. And it's basically inviting people to be a part of that. And so, I think there's, within the movement itself, I'm aware that there's, nuance. Some people say, is it just pedagogy? Is it content? Is it both? And so, maybe it's our inclination as social scientists to try to, bracket everything. And I think you can definitely land on some categories to help us wrap our heads around it. But these are some of the unifying things that I think are there.
I think what I'd like to add is that I believe that classical education asks something of the learner. And at my schools, it also asks something of the family. I tell parents often when they come to a parent meeting, if you're not ready to do this with your children, maybe we're not the place for you, because education involves the family. It involves conversations. And so I'm not only asking my students to learn something or memorize something or be able to calculate something, but then I want them to consider what their place in the world is in relation to what they've just learned. How will you use it? What will you do with it? I joke with some of my 4th and 5th graders who are incredibly entranced with superheroes. Will you use your power for evil or for good? You now have this beautiful knowledge and understanding. What do you do with it? And I love that classical education takes that step to say, what am I going to do with it? And then go home and talk to your mom and dad about what you're going to do with it, and have that conversation around the dinner table or in carpool line, and then do something about it, which is where that civically minded piece comes in.
And Maegen, if teachers are enjoying, just want to follow up with this, if teachers are enjoying the process, the way of teaching in a classical school, but you also said that it's tough to keep them. So what's going on? Is the primary barrier the salaries looked a little low there. Is that the issue? Or is there something else happening?
I think it's support. I think it's just that they have a network of support, people who are going to help them learn how to teach well. If it's content that they don't know, they have the support from someone who can help, lead them in the right direction. I don't know. And Heather, I don't know if you'll agree or disagree. I've hired a lot of teachers and I've never lost any because of salary. And I'm in a state that doesn't pay exceptionally well. So.
All right. We have time now for audience Q&A. Professor Bartholet.
Thanks. I want to pick up on Paul Peterson's question. So I feel like a lot of what you describe classical education being is what I think of good non-classical education
Yes, ma'am.
being. So I'm wondering what's wrong with non-classical education, and what are the political origins of the classical education movement?
So I would say, just to answer the question about maybe what's wrong or what is the traditional neighborhood school doing differently than we're doing. And I think one of the things that's happened is this idea of standardized testing. And it's taken over in many schools and in many districts, the curriculum. And so they're not only teaching to the test, but many schools are on a 6-week cycle where you teach something, you test it after 6 weeks, and then you move on to the next concept, you teach it, and then you and then you test on it and then you move on. And some of that information is just packed in a backpack and goes home with the student and never comes out again. And so I think what we're doing differently is we're still valuing that content, but we're valuing that content in a very rich manner. And then we're also applying that content over and over again in their lives, because it really matters what happened 200 years ago in our country to understand what's happening in our country today. It matters what happened in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and how they formed their societies. And it often can inform us about our society today. And so we want to take all of that information and use it in a woven, beautiful manner, rather than say, it's not on the state test, I'm not going to teach you this anymore, or we're not going to talk about it again. And so that's where we've seen a breakdown with students coming from the traditional classrooms, is they haven't done that. And then the second thing is there hasn't been an emphasis on real strong literacy, real strong numeracy, and then writing. We don't want our kids just to read. We want them to write and discuss. And so we want to take it further. And I don't tend to see our students who are coming to us out of a traditional neighborhood school who have those skills.
I would like to add to what she said. And I'm a former public school teacher, so I have a very black and white what the difference is. Was not teaching science or what was referred to as social studies. In a classical school, we teach history, but I was not teaching science and social studies for its own sake in my former public school. I would have texts that were nonfiction texts built into the reading block time, but we were not studying anything and of true significance. We have time in our schedule for history and science. So, for example, when I taught history the first semester, we start off with geography, and then I would start teaching ancient Mesopotamia, and we would study ancient Egypt, and then we would study ancient South America. That was first grade. My son, who, when our school opened, he was too old to start at a classical school. He was learning about ancient Mesopotamia in sixth grade. So the difference was five grade levels of difference. And I would also say that our approach is very much narrative. So we have an ability to tell the human story and through a narrative approach. And even in science, we are teaching students about the scientists that came before us and the contributions that they've made to society. And so there's just a lot of content. And so what I would tell you is the biggest difference is the richness of the content, especially in the early elementary. Many students don't have robust history instruction until they get to high school. And even at that point, it doesn't start until, you may have one ancient history class. Well, how do you wrap your mind around Rome and Greece if you've never experienced Rome and Greece until you're 14 or 15 years old? And so through the power of stories, both in history and literature, we do that at a younger age, and there's something for them to hold on to and cycle back to through the years. So, and just one other thing, sorry. Grammar instruction is non-existent in traditional public schools, and it's built into what we do as well.
Yeah, Thomas?
So.
Thank you. Can you give us a sense of the demographics of the students in your schools?
So I would tell you that it's going to depend on where they are geographically located. If they're in a diverse neighborhood, they tend to be diverse schools. We have schools all over the country that come from the students are from all different socioeconomic statuses. I mentioned earlier, we have a school that is, it's Hojo Academy, and it is right outside of a Native American reservation. I think there are 5 different Native American tribes that the students go to that school. And to see classical education there, I mean, that's a very diverse school, and it's just so much fun to be there and see what's going on. So I think the answer is it's just going to depend, because all of these are local founding efforts. And so it's going to depend on what is representative of the community.
So again, the best shot that the snapshot we have is exactly the graphs I showed, right? Where growth is concentrated among, at least in that data, Asians and Hispanics. And so now I think Heather might have a better view, because, when you aggregate things at the state, level, everything gets mushed, but.
And I would agree to some extent that it is geographically determined based on the neighborhoods that the schools are in. However, what we're seeing, at least in North Dallas area, is there's such a huge population growth in that area, and there are people coming from all over the world. And it's been a delight, at least on my campus and the campuses that I supervise in that North Dallas area, to see these families, whether they're coming for Toyota or Texas Instruments or Tesla, and they're moving in and they're looking for something unique for their children. And they're not only bringing their children who are very diverse in where they come from and their culture, but they're bringing their culture and their beliefs and their ideas and their experiences with history or education from other countries into our campuses. And so the rich diversity, not only in the student population, but in the conversations that we're having, is beautiful. And it's such a privilege to provide my students with such a rich experience on campus. They're not sort of in this little tiny bubble, and then they have to go out in the world and experience it for themselves. We're experiencing it day in, day out in a kindergarten classroom on a rug on the floor.
Yeah, Eric?
I'm Eric from Kennesaw State. The school that I mentioned that I helped with is a classical school, and I find actually a lot of maybe not tension, but discussion. Maybe not so much among content among classical schools, but definitely in terms of pedagogy and outcomes. And I'm just wondering if you picked up on any of that in your surveys or in your other work.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to outcomes a little bit. Years ago, one of the major national classical associations released a study where they could compare their graduates to a national sample. And they were finding things, for instance, whether classical school graduates had a greater sense of purpose in their life, or were more grateful, right? Some of these kind of mental health indicators, and they looked way more positive than other graduates. And so I'll refer to, it's called the Good Soil Report. So you could look that up. What we've been doing at the lab is doing studies on evaluating some pedagogical approaches. So one of the ones we did a couple years ago was a study on what happens when you integrate poetry into the science curriculum. And so for 2 weeks, some kindergarten through second graders got poetry alongside what they were supposed to be learning in science. So first graders, for instance, were learning about birds. And instead of just doing birds from whatever they were doing, nonfiction texts, we curated poems that the teachers had to teach alongside birds, right? And so, they did Emily Dickinson's A Bird Came Down the Walk One Day, It Did Not Know I Saw, It Bit an Angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw, or something like that, So but like that poem, I mean, kids love it, right? Like kids love poetry, the rhyme, the meter, the joy that there's reading that. But also in that particular poem, I mean, Emily Dickinson does such a good job of picking up like little details of what the bird is doing and observation, right? And what we found in that study was that the students that got poetry, relative to the control group that didn't get poetry, they started noticing what they were studying in class outside the classroom more often. So you ask a first grader, oh, do you start noticing birds? Do you notice what color they are when you see them? They're like, yeah, they're more likely to be engaged with what this is. So anyway, so I think there's part of the mission of the lab is to start to bring some data and evaluation to this, but it's certainly consistent, I think, with what classical educators have been trying to articulate for a while.
We'll go to Mariana, and then over here. Yeah, Mariana.
Hello, Mariana Davidovich with the Foundation for Economic Education. And basically, I just say, first of all, that I tried to get my kids into a Barney school. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. I couldn't. There's a lottery. We didn't get in. But I've been over the last 20 years or so, I'm seeing this incredible growth in demand. So the market is clearly signaling that parents want this. What I find fascinating is that they don't always know why these schools are so great, but they see the outcomes of their neighbors' kids. Everyone wants their kids to go to these schools. The kids are happy, they're excited, they're learning. It's just a beautiful thing. So what is the problem? Why can't we meet the demand?
Well, I think for us, specifically in Texas, we run into challenges. One of those challenges is real estate. Real estate's expensive. And so we've done all sorts of things where we've taken over a strip mall and turned it into a classical school, and it works beautifully. My campus happens to be one of the ones that we did a ground up build, but that required a significant amount of upfront capital to acquire the land, do the permits, all of the things that are involved in school. So I think a lot to do with just the financial reality of finding facilities and being able to put those facilities in place. For some areas, I know this is the case in California, it's getting charters, right? And so a lot of times local districts, if you need to be chartered by the local district, or states are maybe resistant to offer additional charters, or they just don't have the capacity to do so. Or like was mentioned earlier, they feel that we're stealing from the traditional neighborhood, whether it be NCA or whether it be some other manner. And so I think that's a huge challenge for us in getting off of the ground. Someone asked me just yesterday if I could remove any boundary or challenge as a classical school leader and someone who is passionate about opening and building classical schools, what would it be? And I said simply the bureaucracy it takes to start the school. I envy a little bit these micro schools with this ability just to pop up and open. You know, we opened our Prosper campus with almost 800 students. That's a huge opening, and it took really a tremendous effort to get that to happen. Fortunately, Responsive Education Solutions is really good at doing that, the organization I work for, but not everybody has that backing and that history and that experience and those contexts to be able to do that. We actually, founders just started a micro school this year as well as an online school. And so we're working into that space to reach those families. But I mean, our wait list at Prosper is nearing the 3,000s. Our partner school, which is down the street in Frisco, is over 3,000 in their wait list and counting. And so it is a lottery, and there's many families like you who aren't able to take part in what we're doing.
All right. So go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to add, finding school leaders is also extremely challenging. So we can get the teachers, we get local citizen groups who are very interested, but then finding the right person to lead the school, because there has to be, you know, they have to be classical and they have to also know how to run a school. And sometimes you can be classical and not know how to run a school, or you can know how to run a school and you have no classical. And so in order to support an entire K-12 faculty, finding a school leader is like finding a unicorn.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Final question. I think we have to wrap things up.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Curtis Endorf, formerly the founder and president of Great Hearts Online and Great Hearts Micro Schools, which are classical K-12 schools. And Texas is 12,000 kids in that Texas report for classical education. A question I have for you all as we think about this conference and alternative models, classical education can often be rigid or fixed in its approach to pedagogy, culture, and traditions. And new school models are not fixed in those ways. And so how do you think about the tension behind the purpose for classical education and the need for innovation and structural evolution in alternative school models?
I can take that. I think what you're referring to is what we would call hyperclassical. And that is what we are not. We do believe that there are great things that have come out of just the educational environment that should be part of a classical education. So I think it goes to your point about good teaching, right? We want to take this content and we want to pair it with excellent teaching, and we want to coach and support teachers for that. We do not like the word rigor. One of my teammates jokes that equates to dead bodies. And so, you know, she says rigor mortis. And so I would think robust and vigorous, excellent pacing in the classroom are better ways to describe. No, I don't want anybody to walk away thinking that this is, you know, the old school marm with a ruler in, you know, the early 1900s.
Well, and I would also piggyback to say that classical education has really been on the rise and has a strong movement within the homeschool arena as well. And so many families are able to use classical education in a homeschool model or a hybrid model where maybe they're in school for a couple of days and then at home for a few days. And so that really has a key role in this space now. And classical education is doing very well in that arena.
All right. Well, thank you very much.